Can you believe that the fate of Western civilization, the very balance between the church and the state, rested entirely on a single, impossible moment of childbirth, delivered by a woman long past the age of bearing children, surrounded by skeptics and spies? This is not just history. This is the opening act of a catastrophe no one saw coming. The birth of the last true Roman emperor, the man history would nickname the wonder of the world.
Before we begin this immersive, sweeping journey through the life of Frederick II, the man who dared to challenge the very foundations of God's authority on earth, you must understand the sheer, terrifying power he inherited, and how quickly it vanished. His father was Henry VI, the terrifying son of the legendary Barbarossa, a man whose ambition stretched from the freezing Rhine to the sun-baked olive groves of southern Italy. Henry VI was the undisputed master of Europe, holding the German crown, the imperial crown, and, crucially, the crown of Sicily, a jewel snatched through a marriage treaty that felt more like a grand, historical heist. That heist was his marriage to Constance of Sicily, an elderly, cloistered Norman princess, decades his senior, who represented the last legitimate claim to the enormously wealthy kingdom of Sicily. When Henry and Constance wed, the world whispered, "This union is purely political, barren, and transactional." The Hohenstaufen dynasty would secure the land, but surely no heir would follow. But destiny, it seems, has a morbid sense of humor. In December 1194, Henry VI was at the terrifying zenith of his power, having ruthlessly crushed a rebellion in Sicily and solidified his claim. Yet, just as the empire seemed invincible, a strange, undeniable miracle began to unfold. Constance was pregnant. She was over 40 years old, a time in the medieval world where such a pregnancy was deemed unnatural, almost impossible. Whispers of fakery, of a politically motivated deception, spread like wildfire across the jealous papal states and the rebellious Norman barons. Constance, realizing the monumental political danger, knew she had to prove the legitimacy of this miraculous, game-changing child. In a move of stunning, desperate political theater, Constance traveled to the town of Jesse, where on the day after Christmas, 1194, she gave birth not in a private chamber, but in a massive public pavilion, surrounded by a crowd of matrons and cardinals. They watched every agonizing push and strain, every drop of blood, ensuring that no one could ever deny the lineage of this child, this living, breathing claim to the two most powerful empires in Europe.
The child was named Frederick Roger, a name that screamed defiance, tying together the proud Hohenstaufen legacy with the fierce Norman heritage of his mother. The child was born literally watched by the world, but he would grow up completely alone.
For 2 years, the infant Frederick was the greatest treasure in Christendom, guaranteed the German throne, the imperial throne, and the kingdom of Sicily. Henry VI, the ruthless architect of this vast domain, was already planning the future crusades, dreaming of a universal monarchy that would eclipse even Charlemagne. His death was not just a tragedy, it was a political earthquake that instantly obliterated the stability of the entire continent. The immense, sprawling Hohenstaufen power structure, which had relied entirely on Henry's iron will and military genius, fragmented instantly. Germany dissolved into civil war, ignoring the infant Frederick entirely, choosing competing claimants for the imperial crown. The 2-year-old child who had been born to rule the world was instantly abandoned by the world.
Constance, suddenly a widow, found herself isolated, ruling a hostile Sicilian kingdom filled with barons who hated her German husband and were now eager to dislodge her small son. She faced an impossible choice: hold the German claim and lose Sicily, or protect Sicily and sacrifice the Holy Roman Empire title, at least temporarily.
In a desperate attempt to save her son's southern inheritance, Constance swiftly crowned Frederick as King of Sicily, immediately ending the German claim over the island to appease the Pope and the local nobility. She was sacrificing half of his destiny to save the other half. But even this monumental sacrifice was not enough to secure the child's future. Within a year of his father's catastrophic death, Constance herself fell ill. The woman who had fought against nature, politics, and skeptical armies to bring Frederick into the world was now on her deathbed, scrambling to protect her 3-year-old son from the wolves closing in.
She died, leaving her son orphaned, an enemy of the Church, yet simultaneously under its direct guardianship. The child who was supposed to unite Europe was now a pawn, a political orphan abandoned in the chaotic, sun-drenched streets of Palermo, fighting for scraps of loyalty while the German princes forgot his name. His reign, the most brilliant and destructive in European history, began not with a crown, but with utter, terrifying abandonment. The wonder of the world was now little more than a royal street urchin, preyed upon by every ambitious mercenary, bishop, and bandit in the Mediterranean. This is where our story truly begins, deep in the shadows of Sicily, where the boy king struggled simply to survive.
The infant king was surrounded by hyenas, but even hyenas need a lioness to distract them. That lioness was his mother, Constance of Sicily, who knew exactly how frail her son's claim was. She had to stabilize the ship, and her final, desperate, brilliant move was the single greatest political surrender in medieval history. She knew that if she died, and she was already frail, exhausted by the relentless demands of the crown, the mercenary captains currently holding Sicily would carve up her son and his kingdom like a Christmas goose. She needed a guardian powerful enough to terrify them all.
A guardian so enormous in prestige and spiritual authority that no earthly prince dare defy his decree. She looked north, not to the German princes who hated the Hohenstaufens, but straight to the Vatican.
She bequeathed Frederick, the future king of Sicily and Holy Roman Emperor, directly to the care of the Pope, Innocent III. This was not a move of piety. It was a checkmate of sheer, terrifying pragmatism. Constance died barely a year after Henry VI, taking her final secrets with her.
Frederick was now an orphan, not yet 4 years old, a tiny, magnificent pawn caught between the ultimate spiritual power and the very real, bloody chaos of the streets. German, French, and local Italian mercenaries, hired by Henry VI and now jobless, turned their swords upon the very kingdom they were supposed to protect. The most notorious of these bandits was Marquard of Onweiler.
Marquard, a German ministerialis, claimed to be Frederick's regent, demanding control over Apulia and Sicily. He was a brute, a military commander who cared nothing for the subtleties of law or papal decree, only for the clang of steel and the scent of loot. Pope Innocent III fought Marquard politically and militarily, but the Pope was far away in Rome. Frederick, meanwhile, was trapped in Palermo. His palace, once the jewel of the Norman kings, became a dilapidated, guarded cage.
The city itself was a melting pot of filth, genius, and danger. Arabic scholars, Jewish merchants, Greek fishermen, and Norman soldiers jostled for space. And right there, amongst the grit, was the boy king. He was not raised in sheltered isolation. He was often ignored, sometimes outright neglected, by the dwindling court staff, who were too busy plotting their own survival or stealing state funds. Frederick ran the streets like a magnificent, forgotten street urchin. He learned the dialects of the market, the guttural slang of the sailors, and the quiet cunning needed to survive among the beggars and thieves. This lack of formal, protected upbringing was the great tragedy and the great blessing of his early life. While other princes were being drilled in Latin rhetoric and courtly manners, Frederick was mastering the brutal physics of survival. He saw poverty, cruelty, and the raw, unvarnished truth of human nature every single day. He watched mercenaries march in and out, shifting allegiances like cheap cloaks. He learned distrust better than any courtly dance. While this fragile genius in the making was fending for himself in the dirty alleyways of Palermo, the wider empire was burning. The German princes refused to accept a 4-year-old child living in Sicily as their emperor. This civil war, years long and incredibly destructive, was, paradoxically, Frederick's greatest shield. While Germany was occupied, tearing itself apart, no major power had the bandwidth or the unity to come south and definitively seize Sicily. The prize was too large, the opposition too fragmented. So Frederick remained under the nominal protection of Innocent III, growing wilder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Innocent III eventually defeated Marquard of Onweiler, but the chaos simply changed uniforms. Now the papal legates arrived, treating the kingdom not as a trust to be protected, but as an opportunity for extortion. The boy kings saw the ultimate hypocrisy. Those who claimed to serve God and protect the orphan were often the greediest of all. The papal officials bled the treasury dry, leaving Frederick's court impoverished and powerless.
He learned how to compartmentalize, how to speak many languages to many different people, and most importantly, how to wait. He was the golden eagle raised in a cage of vipers, slowly, silently, growing his talons.
The ultimate test came when he was just 10 years old. The forces of his rival, Otto IV, finally began to stabilize Germany and look south with hungry eyes.
The stage was set for the ultimate showdown, but first, Frederick had to survive one last, deadly siege in the very city that had raised him. The time for running the streets was over. The time for ruling the kingdom was about to be forced upon him.
This was the fire that would temper the Stupor Mundi.
The shadow of the papacy was long, and in 1208, as Frederick approached the terrifying age of 14, that shadow finally lifted, but not in protection, in judgment. For years, Pope Innocent III had nominally been his guardian, a legal fiction that masked the terrifying reality. The richest kingdom in Europe was being systematically looted by mercenary captains and ambitious local barons who saw the boy king as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, a puppet whose strings they happily cut whenever they wanted a new palace or a fresh tax levy. The very men tasked with securing the kingdom were the vultures circling the corpse of the Hohenstaufen dream.
The Pope, brilliant and uncompromising, had secured the boy's spiritual and territorial claims, but only at a crippling price. Frederick was forced to swear allegiance, confirming that the Kingdom of Sicily was a papal fief, shackling his southern power to Rome's will before he even knew how to shave. This was the humiliating entry fee for re-entering his own life.
He was not yet 15, but his eyes held the cold, calculating fire of a man who had seen empires crumble and survived on grit. He started small, focusing on Palermo, systematically calling in the debts, both financial and bloody, owed by the very men who thought he was a joke.
The process was swift, ruthless, and absolutely necessary. Castles were seized, titles revoked, and some of the most powerful German captains who had mocked the boy ruler suddenly found themselves facing confiscation, exile, or the executioner's block. He was recovering the royal domain, piece by piece, castle by shattered castle, proving to every skeptic that the boy they had starved was now the king who would feast on their betrayal. This was the founding of the new Sicilian state, built not on mercy, but on unyielding centralized control. A political structure far ahead of its medieval time. Yet, the chaos wasn't confined to greedy Christian lords.
The island of Sicily itself was a powder keg, divided by faith and history. The Muslim population, the Saracens, descendants of the former rulers, had retreated to the harsh, mountainous interior, creating effective, defiant strongholds that had become a haven for bandits and rebels. This was a direct challenge to the authority he was desperately trying to re-establish. He understood power and he understood loyalty, forged in shared adversity and total dependence. He made a devastating, cunning calculation that still echoes through history. He launched a series of brutal, highly efficient military campaigns, not to massacre the Saracens, but systematically to break their strongholds and force their complete surrender.
The end result was a massive, forced relocation that shocked the continent. Tens of thousands of Saracens, stripped of their independence and their Sicilian lands, were deported across the narrow strait to the mainland of Apulia, to a newly established city called Lucera. This was geopolitical brilliance wrapped in ruthlessness. By concentrating the skilled Saracen archers and specialized cavalry in one location, under his direct, absolute control, Frederick created a personal, standing army, an army utterly devoted to him because they were utterly dependent on him for survival. They had no loyalty to the local barons, no allegiance to the Pope, and no cultural ties to the Christian population they were tasked with policing. They were the king's men, an exotic, terrifying military force, impervious to excommunication, and driven by the highest professional standards of war. This single audacious move not only stabilized Sicily, removing an internal threat, but armed Frederick with a lethal weapon ready to be deployed against anyone, German barons, rebellious cities, or the Papacy itself, who dared challenge the legitimacy of the Stupor Mundi. But no matter how tight his grip became on the sunny, fertile south, the thunder rolled endlessly from the icy German north. Frederick was, by birthright, the king of the Romans, the rightful heir to the Holy Roman Empire, a title currently being held, or rather brutally mishandled, by his rival, Otto IV of Brunswick, a wealth dynasty upstart propped up by the Papacy until he inevitably betrayed them. By 1210, Otto IV had marched his armies down the peninsula, threatening the very borders of the Sicilian kingdom, poised to snatch the prize that Frederick had risked his life reclaiming. The world held its breath. Frederick, barely 16, faced the most powerful man in Europe bearing down on him, and it looked like the swift, brutal end to the short reign of the Wonder Child. But in history, sometimes, the greatest betrayals open the greatest doors. Otto IV, blinded by ambition, made the fatal mistake of attacking papal territory, the very man who had given him the crown. Pope Innocent III, the man who had been Frederick's reluctant guardian, now saw Otto as the ultimate existential threat. A desperate delegation of German princes, weary of Otto's tyranny, the constant civil war, and eager for a legitimate, powerful ruler, made a perilous journey south. They did not travel to the Pope in Rome. They traveled all the way to Palermo, the newly stabilized, exotic court of the young, strange king who had survived the streets. The greatest mind of the 13th century was disguised as a common traveler, threading his way through the boot of Italy, a journey that should have been utterly impossible. Every kilometer was controlled by sworn enemies, the Tuscan League, the powerful Lombard cities, and the heavily armed forces of the Papal States, all secretly or openly aligned with his brutal rival, the massive, bull-necked Otto IV of Brunswick. The stakes were life and death, and the path ahead was paved with betrayal. They moved like shadows, riding only at night, avoiding the main Roman roads, sleeping in ditches and abandoned monasteries that offered cold comfort. The bounty on Frederick's head, dead or alive, brought back to Otto IV in chains, was astronomical, posted in every major piazza, from Rome to Florence. He learned to distinguish the chilling sound of a papal patrol from a local bandit gang, and how to sleep fully armored, ready for instant, reckless flight at the slightest noise. His small party was nearly betrayed several times, relying only on sheer speed, incredible luck, and the occasional crucial loyalty of a scattered Ghibelline mayor, who still remembered the glory and the overwhelming power of Frederick's grandfather, Frederick Barbarossa.
The psychological toll of this desperate journey, spanning hundreds of perilous miles, must have been unimaginable, turning the cultured Sicilian into a hardened warrior king. But the true, terrifying nightmare began when they reached the soaring, jagged peaks of the Alps. It was late summer, and though the passes were not yet snow-choked, they were treacherous, guarded by mercenary companies paid by the powerful Guelph cities like Milan and Pavia.
These mercenaries were deployed with one single deadly mission: to seal the gate to Germany and capture the young emperor. Frederick chose the most difficult, least traveled mountain trails, paths meant for goats and smugglers, not for men leading the future of an empire. They were constantly watched, feeling the cold, silent breath of pursuit right behind them, knowing that one wrong turn meant immediate capture. Just outside the crucial pass leading to Trent, disaster struck like a sudden thunderbolt. A large contingent of Guelph cavalry, alerted to the movement of a suspicious, heavily armed group traveling off route, swept down the valley with frightening speed, aiming to intercept them and claim the ultimate prize that was Frederick's life. This was not merely a battle for territory. It was a desperate, chaotic skirmish for the lifeblood of the entire Hohenstaufen dynasty. Frederick's tiny guard, led by his most trusted Saracen veteran, fought with the terrifying ferocity of cornered lions, buying precious minutes for their master to slip away, scrambling up the rock face while arrows whistled mere inches past his head, embedding themselves in the stone behind him. He made it through the pass, losing several valuable men, leaving them behind in the harsh grasp of the mountain snows. But he was alive, exhausted, freezing, and utterly alone. Frederick II finally descended into the German lands, the ancestral home and power base of the Hohenstaufens, the territory known as Swabia. This was the heartland of his lineage, the birthplace of his grandfather, Frederick Barbarossa. But where was the welcoming army? Where were the banners and the cheering, rapturous crowds he might have dreamed of in his youth? There was only cold, frightening silence. The German princes, terrified of Otto IV's massive military power and the vast financial backing of the English crown, King John was Otto's uncle, were hedging their bets, unwilling to commit to the vulnerable youth. Frederick arrived not as a conquering monarch, but as a vagabond pretender, riding a tired, spent horse into the small, unwalled town of Constance. He was expecting massive hostility, but what he encountered was far worse than resistance. He found total indifference. The greatest prince in Christendom was simply ignored by the powerful local elites. But history, that fickle mistress, pivots on a razor's edge, often determined by milliseconds and sudden intuition. At that exact critical moment, the Bishop of Constance, a man secretly sympathetic to the old, glorious Hohenstaufen cause, received a terrifying intelligence message. Otto IV was marching full speed towards the city with a huge punitive army, intending to secure Constance and seal the entire border against his rival forever. The bishop had mere minutes to decide the fate of Europe and the entire German succession. If he allowed Frederick to enter, he was committing treason against the ruling emperor, Otto IV, and inviting the utter destruction of his city and his people. If he locked the gates, the last hope of the Hohenstaufens would be captured and killed instantly outside the walls. He looked at the weary, scholarly figure on the horse, this unbelievable youth who had survived the inferno of Italy and the horrors of the Alps, and he made his choice, guided by destiny. As Otto IV's vanguard appeared on the distant horizon, kicking up massive dust plumes that signaled impending, unavoidable doom, the bishop threw open the massive, fortified city gates. Frederick II, the child of Sicily, the intellectual raised among Saracens, rode into Constance just 3 hours, a heartbeat of time, before Otto IV arrived at the gates, only to find them slammed shut and barred with heavy iron chains. The greatest psychological victory in the emperor's life had been won by a matter of minutes and a single brave bishop. The game was truly, violently afoot. Otto IV, enraged beyond measure, could only stare at the impregnable walls that now shielded his rival. He knew now that Frederick was not just a naive child. He was the ghost of a lineage resurrected in flesh and blood, and ghosts are notoriously hard to kill. The stage was finally set for the ultimate, brutal showdown, the collision of two self-proclaimed emperors fighting for one glittering, sacred crown. The fires of Sicilian rebellion had finally been banked, but the embers still glowed hot enough to scorch a child emperor. Frederick, now barely 10 years old, had survived the impossible: assassination attempts, palace coups, and the hungry greed of barons who saw the royal treasury as their personal piggy bank. He was a king in name only, a magnificent, fragile pawn, constantly protected by the towering shadow of Pope Innocent III, who, let's be honest, was far more interested in managing the kingdom of Sicily than in nurturing its future ruler. Innocent III, the most powerful man in the Christian world, was a warden, not a guardian. He recognized Frederick's lineage and the sheer gravity of the crown, but he held the reins tight. Every decision, every appointment, every scrap of food Frederick ate was filtered through the papal legates,
stern men who ensured the young king never forgot who truly held the temporal power over the island paradise. But while the Pope controlled the armies and the laws, he could not control the boy's mind. This period, this strange, claustrophobic youth in Palermo, was where the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, was forged. Trapped within the gilded cages of the Norman palaces, Frederick didn't just study. He devoured knowledge like a starving man tearing into a feast. Greek, Latin, Arabic, German, Sicilian dialect, he mastered them all, not out of mere academic curiosity, but because understanding languages was understanding power, trade routes, and the secrets whispered in the courts of his enemies. The world outside his library was a brutal, medieval reality, constantly demanding his attention. But inside, Frederick was building a fortress of pure intellect. He surrounded himself with Jewish scholars, Muslim mathematicians, and Christian philosophers, creating an atmosphere of intellectual synergy utterly unique in 13th century Europe. He wasn't just receiving an education, he was curating a renaissance, preparing for a fight he didn't even know he was about to enter, sharpening the very weapons that would make him feared across the continent.
The Pope, seeing the necessity of stabilizing the political landscape and raising critical funds, arranged a marriage, a necessary evil of high-stakes monarchy. When Frederick was just 14, still legally a minor in the eyes of many northern lords, the political machine decreed he must wed a woman who could bring immediate stability and military might. His bride was Constance of Aragon, a formidable widow 10 years his senior, sister to the King of Aragon.
This was not romance. This was high-level statecraft dressed up in silk and gold. Constance brought with her not only maturity and a royal lineage, but 500 knights, real battle-hardened soldiers from the Iberian Peninsula, and a dowry of cold, hard cash, crucial for paying off mercenaries and rebellious barons. Suddenly, the boy king had a small, loyal, professional army entirely independent of the perpetually shifting loyalties of the Sicilian magnates and the watchful eyes of the papal legates.
This marriage, concluded in 1209, signaled the end of the strict papal regency and Frederick's technical ascension to full adulthood and kingship in Sicily. The chains were loosening, and Frederick, now the true master of his island, began to consolidate his power with ruthless efficiency, demonstrating the cold, calculated political mind inherited from his Hohenstaufen ancestors. But the ultimate test, the collision course with destiny, was yet to come, brewing far away in the German heartland. Because while Frederick was finally securing his sunny island kingdom, the vast, terrifying theater of the Holy Roman Empire to the north was collapsing into catastrophic civil war. Remember Otto IV, the Guelph rival, the man crowned emperor by the Pope himself, the man who was supposed to eradicate the Hohenstaufen line forever? Well, Otto had the crown, but he had the political finesse of a charging, blind bull.
He rapidly alienated the very Pope who had crowned him by aggressively seizing papal lands in central Italy, the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. Innocent III, having initially backed Otto as a counterweight to the Hohenstaufen threat, now realized he had simply swapped one imperial danger for an even more violent and unpredictable one. The Church's thunderous, world-shaking excommunication descended upon Otto, casting him out from the sacred body of Christendom. They needed a legitimate figurehead, a true Ghibelline champion, a man whose very bloodline was the definition of imperial power. The most powerful ecclesiastical princes, the archbishops of Mainz and Magdeburg, along with King Ottokar I of Bohemia, began to whisper. These whispers quickly coalesced into a desperate, dangerous plan. They needed Frederick to leave his secured throne in Sicily and make the 1,000-mile journey north into the heart of the German winter, right into the jaws of Otto's armies.
The stakes were beyond comprehension. If Frederick accepted, he risked everything. He would be traversing enemy territory for months, entirely reliant on luck and the fickle loyalties of Italian cities. If he failed, he would lose Sicily, his life, and plunge the entirety of the empire back into relentless, generation-long chaos. If he succeeded, he would unify the most powerful empire since ancient Rome.
The risk was absolute, but the reward was the entire world. In 1211, the crucial, life-altering delegation arrived secretly in Palermo. 3 German envoys, cloaked in shadow and urgency, carried the formal, revolutionary request: abandon Sicily and come claim the German crown, the birthright his father had died for. Frederick, then only 17, sat before them, a newly married king, a scholar, a polyglot, but still deeply inexperienced in high military command. He knew the journey was a death trap. He would have to cross the Papal States, which were only nominally friendly, and then traverse the entire length of Italy, a gauntlet of hostile Guelph cities before reaching the treacherous mountain passes. Otto's spies were everywhere. Otto's armies controlled the north. This was not a standard military campaign. It was a desperate, almost suicidal dash for destiny across a continent on fire.
But Frederick was the son of Henry VI, the grandson of Barbarossa. He understood blood and destiny better than contemporary politics. He saw not the danger, but the divine command, the absolute justification for his existence. He looked at the sealed parchment from the German princes, at the weary faces of the envoys, and the decision was instantaneous, electrifying. He accepted the challenge. He would leave his wife, his young son Henry, and his secured kingdom behind, betting everything on a single audacious journey.
The preparations were silent and swift. He gathered a small, loyal, almost insignificant retinue, a handful of knights, a few scribes, and crucially, his closest Arab and Jewish bodyguards, men whose loyalty transcended the European power struggles. He mortgaged his remaining personal assets to raise quick cash, knowing that coin would be his only friend in the hostile north, where trust was a fool's luxury.
In the spring of 1212, under the cover of a thick Mediterranean dawn, the Sicilian king, the undisputed heir of the Hohenstaufen line, slipped out of Palermo. He was heading towards a continent engulfed in war,
towards an enemy who controlled every road, towards a destiny that promised either absolute, universal power or a cold, unmarked grave in the frozen soil of Germany. The great adventure, the most audacious political gamble of the Middle Ages, had officially begun, and history held its breath.
The year 1197 had already stolen a king, but fate was far from finished with the boy emperor. Just months after the earth-shattering death of his father, the fragile grip of Empress Constance, the only anchor holding the fractured Norman kingdom together, began to slip drastically. She was old, weary, and knew the terrifying truth. The German barons would never tolerate a baby king, and the Sicilian nobles were already sharpening their knives for a land grab that would tear her ancestral kingdom to shreds.
Constance, facing the abyss of total collapse, made a last-ditch decision that would redefine the power balance of the Mediterranean for decades, a move born of desperate maternal instinct and profound strategic genius. She had to place her vulnerable son under the protection of the only power strong enough and self-interested enough to defend him, the Church itself. With her final, fading strength, she formally repudiated the imperial claims, renounced her son's claim to the German throne, and bequeathed the Kingdom of Sicily, that jewel in the crown of Europe, the wealthiest kingdom of its size, to the ultimate spiritual landlord, the greatest pope of the age, Innocent III. This was the ultimate political hostage exchange, a gamble on God and ambition.
The irony was thick enough to choke on. The Papacy, which had spent 50 years fighting the Hohenstaufen dynasty tooth and nail, was now the sole protector of its last male heir, forced by geopolitical necessity to shield the very family it hated. But while the Pope was far away in the polished halls of Rome, the reality on the ground in Palermo was rapidly dissolving into total, brutal anarchy.
The gilded cage of the magnificent Norman palace in Palermo rapidly became a hostile, forgotten ruin. The very moment Constance died, the entire infrastructure of the Sicilian kingdom shattered into a million violent, self-serving pieces. Barons seized castles. German mercenaries hired by Henry VI turned into roving bandit gangs, and the essential social order simply ceased to exist, replaced by a ruthless scramble for power. The boy emperor, the king of Sicily, Duke of Swabia, the literal grandson of the greatest Norman king, Roger II, was essentially abandoned in the heart of the chaos he was meant to rule. The papal legates, tasked with his solemn care, were more interested in fighting local rebellions, enriching themselves, and looting the royal treasury than in educating or even properly feeding a sovereign.
Frederick grew up not in the hallowed halls of courtly refinement and intellectual peace, but literally in the rough, teeming, often terrifying streets of Palermo itself. He was surrounded by a cacophony of cultures, languages, and constant visceral dangers. German soldiers fighting Saracen bodyguards, Greek merchants haggling with Jewish scholars,
all coexisting in a volatile urban powder keg. This was his true, unforgiving schooling, the gutter academy of survival. He learned to distinguish between true loyalty and treacherous flattery, not from a dusty textbook or a polite tutor, but from the brutal, instant consequences of trusting the wrong face or turning his back at the wrong time. He was a prize, often hungry, frequently ragged, always guarded by questionable, desperate men, constantly on the brink of being kidnapped or assassinated by rogue noble factions hungry for the crown. While other young European princes were learning Latin declensions, chivalric poetry, and the proper etiquette for a royal dinner, Frederick was mastering 5 languages, observing the raw, unfiltered dynamics of human power, and developing a deep, abiding, and practical cynicism toward organized religion and institutional authority. He watched the world tear itself apart and understood a primal truth that no priest or professor could teach, that titles meant nothing, only cunning, adaptability, ruthlessness, and sheer intellectual force mattered. He became fluent in Arabic, spoke Greek, German, and French, and immersed himself deeply in the Saracen culture that formed his only reliable, disciplined protection against the greedy Christian nobles. The trauma of abandonment and the crucible of anarchy forged the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. The man who would later write a definitive treatise on falconry, manage a vast imperial menagerie filled with exotic beasts, and staff his court with philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers, was first and foremost a street fighter who had survived absolute existential chaos. His early life was a constant, low-grade terror, a desperate scramble for legitimacy against an endless tide of ambitious enemies who saw him as nothing more than a temporary obstacle to be brutally removed. He was a living, breathing symbol of contested authority, a child whose very existence destabilized the entire political architecture of the Mediterranean and the Holy Roman Empire. The grasping nobility and the fearful papacy believed they had successfully stripped him of everything: his German inheritance, his stability, and his power base. But in doing so, they inadvertently gave him the greatest, most profound education possible: the unvarnished, brutal truth of human nature and governance. This raw, uncompromising foundation would allow him to step back onto the stage years later, not as a weak, easily manipulated boy, but as the most formidable, terrifyingly intelligent ruler the West had ever dared to witness. The political vacuum created by his parents' tragic deaths was vast, but Frederick was silently absorbing every lesson the Sicilian hellscape had to offer, building an internal fortress of knowledge. The question was not if he would rise from the rubble of his childhood, but when he would unleash the terrifying, multifaceted power that had been forged in the white-hot crucible of anarchy, ready to reclaim every last shred of the dazzling inheritance stolen from him. The stage was being meticulously set for the young, hungry eagle to finally take majestic flight. But first, he had to survive the wolves surrounding the nest for just a little while longer.
The clock was ticking down to the moment young Frederick, the ultimate prize and the most dangerous orphan in Europe, finally came of age. 14 years. 14 years of constant, suffocating surveillance by papal legates, of navigating a court where every smile masked a dagger, and where the air itself was thick with the scent of conspiracy. The power vacuum that had defined his childhood was about to be violently filled by the rightful heir, and the ancient Norman kingdom would feel the full, terrible force of a Hohenstaufen king asserting his long-delayed authority. The year was 1209. The political calculus was brutal and swift. Frederick needed legitimacy, allies, and, most pressingly, an heir to solidify the tenuous Hohenstaufen claim. His chosen bride was Constance of Aragon, a formidable woman nearly 10 years his senior, the widow of the King of Hungary, already seasoned by the savage realities of royal politics. She was not a love match. She was a geopolitical fortress, bringing vital Spanish connections, seasoned advice, and a gravitas the teenage king sorely lacked. The wedding was less a celebration of romance and more a cold declaration of independence, a clear signal to the rebellious barons and the watchful pope that the puppet strings were finally being severed from Palermo's royal palace. Frederick was intelligent, but he was also pragmatic and utterly ruthless, a trait he inherited equally from both the Hohenstaufen fire and the Norman steel. He immediately set about the Herculean task of crushing the entrenched feudal anarchy that had blossomed across Sicily and southern Italy during his long minority. For years, powerful barons had seized royal lands, minted their own currency, and acted as independent sovereigns, laughing at the idea of a teenage king successfully reclaiming his birthright. They believed their power was absolute. But Frederick, the Stupor Mundi in training, understood the levers of real power, and he saw the potential in a population others feared and persecuted, the Saracens of Sicily. The Muslim population, though often repressed by Christian lords, represented a crucial military force, loyal, professional, and entirely detached from the greedy, squabbling feudal network that characterized the Christian aristocracy. This wasn't charity, it was strategic brilliance. He was building a personal, standing army, a fiercely loyal shock troop force, ready to strike down any rebellious Christian lord who dared challenge the crown's renewed authority. He was consolidating his southern base with the kind of calculated risk-taking that would define his entire reign, transforming the disorganized anarchic kingdom into a centralized, modern state, ready for war. While Frederick was busy dismantling the Sicilian aristocracy and creating his powerful Saracen bodyguard, the true prize, the German imperial crown, was dangling precariously far to the north. The political landscape was quickly descending into a catastrophic mess of betrayed alliances. Otto IV, the wealth challenger whom the Pope had reluctantly backed after the assassination of Frederick's uncle, Philip of Swabia, had grown far too arrogant, far too powerful,
and far too territorial. Otto had not only been crowned emperor in Rome, but had immediately broken every single solemn promise he made to Innocent III. He marched his armies into papal territory, brazenly seizing papal cities, even threatening the Holy See itself, claiming lands that Rome considered inviolable gifts from God. This was the ultimate betrayal. Pope Innocent III, the man who had controlled the levers of Europe for 2 decades, was now facing total humiliation, forced to flee before the advance of the very emperor he had sanctioned. There was only one man left who carried the legitimate bloodline, the only man who could legally challenge Otto IV's usurpation, the very king he had sworn to keep locked away in the safety of Palermo. The hypocrisy was staggering, the danger to Frederick astronomical, but the Pope, driven by survival, threw out the ultimate bait, an official papal deposition of Otto IV, instantly recognizing Frederick, King of Sicily, as the legitimate, divinely ordained heir to the Holy Roman Empire.
The choice was impossible, agonizing. Stay safe in the sun-drenched, sophisticated, familiar cradle of Palermo, or risk everything: his crown, his new wife, his infant son Henry, even his life, by crossing the Alps into a frozen, hostile German landscape ruled by his sworn enemy, Otto IV. Frederick knew the moment he stepped onto the mainland, the entire weight of the Welf armies would be thrown against him, backed by decades of German resentment toward a Sicilian-born emperor. The Pope, fickle as the wind, might abandon him instantly if the tides of fortune turned against the audacious young king.
Yet the blood of the emperor screamed louder than caution. The title of Kaiser was his birthright. The ultimate gamble was set. He gathered a small entourage, kissed his wife goodbye, and prepared to sail, leaving the safety of his island kingdom for the frozen terror of the German storm.